A week had gone by since the planet had been pacified. A solid week. Fleet Marshal Simmons sat in her quarters nursing a cup of coffee. The drumbeat of her fingers on the table suggested she was seconds away from tearing down the wall and storming the bridge. Again. She had to be patient, though. It wouldn't do for her to go out to the bridge wing and start barking for status updates. Reinforcements had arrived, and the Antares had even received a resupply of the small amount of food needed to top off its stores. The fleet was fully operational, and they had already replenished half of the ships back to full ammunition stores. It had been a week since she had taken this system. A solid week. For her, it had been quite possibly the longest week of her life. The Barraki, only a few jumps away, were engaged in a back-and-forth battle against the Vral that had kicked off the moment the Barraki entered the war. From what she read, the Vral were trying not to commit too heavily, which at first amused her. But as the reports kept adding up, it started to infuriate her. The Terran Front Antares fleet was just sitting on its hands right at the border of former Chua space. Her orders from Central Command had been very lenient and broad. Take back all of Chua space and wait for further instructions. It had taken her less than 2 weeks to do that, but now, here she was a full week later, and even though she was ready to plow ahead, she was waiting. She had sent more than one message back to Earth, and for a moment she was reminded of several old statements that encapsulated how she felt right now. The ram has touched the wall. Today's tactical victory does not guarantee tomorrow's strategic success. And her favorite, which was setting her mind on fire. I'm pissing in the Rhine. Now send me gas. She felt like a caged animal, and more she just wanted to pry the bars off. She thought about bringing up her husband's image on the datapad sitting in front of her, and decided against it. Sometimes it calmed her, but right now she didn't want to be calm. She wanted to order the Antares to dive straight through until they reached the Barraki. She wanted to park the Antares over the Vral homeworld and turn it into a slag pile. Her datapad chimed and she glanced at it, then sat back and drank slowly from her cup. The TFS St. Petersburg's repairs were complete, and it was leaving the Antares repair docks. She reached out and tapped the acknowledgement, then stared at the wall. The ground campaign was over. The salvage campaign in space was well underway, with most of the dead hulls arranged and ready for reprocessing. Entire logistics flotillas were already in the system. Why was she still here? Instead of kicking her table over and stalking around, she took another civilized sip of her mug. She was the picture of calm, or so she believed. If she could hear the thoughts of her attendant, who was currently out of her quarters getting another coffee prepared, she would have known she looked like she was actively on the verge of losing her mind. Her datapad chimed again. The TFS Firebrand requested to pull alongside to resupply food stores. Why not? She tapped a short reply of granted. She then stopped herself from hurling the datapad across the room. Civil, calm, the picture of command, the picture of serene composure. At least that is what she tried to convince herself she looked like. A rabid wolverine ready to murder anyone who came within a square mile is what anyone else would say. Her datapad chimed again. She slammed the mug down on the table and coffee splashed out. Her hand snapped out and grabbed hold of the datapad. Fucking damn it, she growled, pulling her hand back to throw. She breathed, then slowly pulled the pad to eye level. Initiate Operation Naked Sun at earliest convenience. Bold letters, type 12 font, Times New Roman. From Central Command. To her. God bless the Terran Front finally. She came out of her seat as if launched from it and stalked to the door. The doors to her quarters opened to the bridge wing. She came out like a tiger chasing a squealing pig. She held up the datapad like a burning sword, an expression of pure and absolute victory on her face. "Get me a fucking channel to the fleet admirals!" she roared. Petty Officer Hazard hid his expression with his shoulder, but from the way his shoulders heaved, she knew he was struggling and failing not to laugh. "In a good mood today, ma'am?" "You're goddamned right." She turned and stalked over to her command table and put the datapad down, opening the message. Intel reports favorable conditions to initiate the breakdown of Antares operational group. Advance all fronts. Begin Operation Naked Sun. Proceed at discretion according to operational plan. "Finally," she whispered, and she glanced over to Hazard, squaring herself toward the display. After a few moments, a feed was sent to her display. Panels were shown, with a green or red outline. Red outlines were turning green, showing that the fleet admirals in question were ready to receive. She brought up a map of the adjoining systems, seeing the branch points of the hyperspace lanes. "Finally," she whispered again. Lieutenant Conrad had always wanted his first command to be like his father's. The picture of his father sat in his cramped quarters, standing stern-faced and ready in front of the Bengal-class destroyer named after someone from Earth's distant past, John C. Stennis. His father had told him stories, rubbing the stump of his right leg, of commanding the 80-crewed quarter-kilometer-long vessel. His father's favorite story was the one that had ended his career, taking on a Vral battleship at point-blank range and crippling it before his own ship started flying apart around him. The rescue that had brought him back from death and the Star of Terra he had received as a result. When Conrad left the Mars Naval Academy, he had hoped he would be slotted for service on a battleship, just like his old man, and then given command of a destroyer, just like his old man. At least the first part went right. Every waking moment of his service on board the TFS Paris, the Thunderchild-class battleship that even now hovered a few thousand kilometers away, he pursued command with fever. His pursuit had been noticed. His studious nature had been noticed. His promotion to lieutenant junior grade came with the remark that officers of his dedication and passion belonged in the captain's chair. As a junior grade, he completed every required training and qualification regarding ship leadership, logistics, fire control, engineering, and navigation that he could get his hands on. The look on his captain's face when they put his new bars on, Conrad couldn't wipe from his mind. In the 2 years he had been on board the Paris, the captain had been like a father figure to him. He didn't know why. Nor could he wipe from his mind the way that same captain had gestured with grandeur out of the viewport of the bridge of the Paris and loudly announced that the command he had sought was his. That was the first time he had seen TFSC 2252. The smile he had worn seeing it was fake. At 67 meters long, it was not a destroyer. It was a corvette, Hornet class, and a brand new one at that. It had the shakedown crew. His crew would be arriving with him. It hadn't even gotten its name yet. There it sat, moored to Thermopylae Station, his first command. His disappointment felt like a vice on his chest. Not a ship expected to fly in formation, but a ship expected to swarm, like a glorified fighter. Conrad never wanted to be a fighter pilot. He had turned down strike-craft schools for a reason. But now, here it was. Still, it wouldn't do to voice that disappointment. He would have to make do. That same day, he moved from the spacious quarters he had been assigned on board the TFS Paris to the quarters barely large enough for a narrow bed over a coffin locker with a fold-down desk. No chair. His bed was his chair. It was cramped. The doors weren't big enough for him to walk through without turning his body. The bridge was the largest space on the entire ship, and even then there was not much room to move around. The gym, if one could even call it that, was the second largest space and held a treadmill and just enough room for a multi-purpose weight machine. The crew mess was just large enough to seat the full crew of 12. Anyone serving on a corvette naturally had to have a psychological screening against claustrophobia, because the last thing you wanted on a ship this size was for someone to start freaking out. Its drive was massively overpowered for a ship its size, which meant the dampeners that handled acceleration Gs would not and could not accommodate correctly. People who served on corvettes were often said to have sea legs because of this, an archaic term used to talk about how sailors who traveled Earth's oceans became accustomed to the ship moving under them. Its weapons were oversized for its tonnage, which meant it shook when it fired. It didn't have sound dampening enough to drown out the noise the corvette made naturally, so sleep was a problem because Conrad preferred silence. The Hornet-class corvette, 2 days after he had taken command, was given the name Dhampir, which Conrad was less than enthused about. He also met his crew and found out that as cramped as the Dhampir was, it was even more cramped with personnel. Then there was the crew. It was said you had to be insane to want to fly around in a corvette, and his crew was certifiable. His executive officer, if you could call her that, was his weapons officer. Again, if you could call her that. In fact, the next highest rank to his was a first-class petty officer, which was his weapons officer. The oldest member of his crew was 28, which was his weapons officer. Gunner's Mate First Class Cassandra Towns, his weapons officer, refused to be called anything other than Cass or Mom, by anyone, including him. She had introduced the rest of the crew, which had trained together and been shipped together from the Mars training yard. A medic who doubled as a damage control technician named Doc, which was short for Mad Doc, the Chua who managed the reactor called Crispy, weapons operators Rev and Dev, no relation be assured, sensor operator Bats, comms operator Fidget, systems technicians Smokey and Crash, and the two engineer technicians BB and Cross. He had given up trying to learn their real names because they didn't respond to them half the time anyway. A few days later, he found out he had gotten a name too. Chill, which, after threatening Cass with a court-martial, he found out was short for chill the fuck out, you rot up the ass bastard. At the end of his first week of command after hearing that, he found he didn't have the shame needed to put that on a disciplinary form. So, no shit, there he was. A freshly minted captain who had expected his first command to be one of pride and prestige, with crisp uniforms and crisper salutes, great mentors, and a vessel with a name that he could speak of with pride and dignity. Instead, he got crammed inside what was essentially a sardine can, with 11 misfits who spent half their time in various states of half in and half out of uniform, and had a relationship with military discipline that could be considered indifferent at best. Conrad didn't even know how these people were found, considering how strict life was pretty much anywhere else. He had dreams of elder mentors, but got none. He had dreams of crisp military discipline. Yes sirs, no sirs, but the best he got was Raj. When he confided in his longtime mentor on the Paris about his crew, he found out that most crews of the smaller corvettes were manned by those who either directly requested it or had passed the psychiatric evaluation to be placed there, and usually they were drawn from a crew who were going to wash out of standard training due to behavior issues. He hated it. He hated it with a passion, until the engine came on. The growl of the overpowered reactor had sent a chill through his spine and a rush of blood through his body, and he felt his eyes bulge open with a sudden surge of adrenaline. They had left Thermopylae, his crew baying as they entered the hyperspace lane, and when Fleet Marshal Simmons had given the order to run down the Vral, he had been howling just like the rest of them. That was 3 weeks ago. Conrad had his feet kicked up. Above his head was the nameplate of the ship with Dhampir crossed out in chalk and Chill's boat written over it. He was wearing his uniform half off with his arm sleeves tied around his waist. Cass was lounging in her railgun carriage seat, her arms hanging down as she slept in the chair. Conrad reached over, flipped his comm panel open, and pressed the button for Excursion Suit 1. "BB," he said and waited. He closed his eyes and blew out a breath, then looked out of the view screen of the bridge. A few seconds later, a figure in an environmentally enclosed spacewalk harness appeared and waved. "How's it looking?" "Bitchin' chill," she said, her voice coming through the speaker next to his head. "I've taken some pictures with this POS camera they have." He couldn't see her face through the visor, the gold leaf hiding it. "Nice," Conrad said. "How do the kill marks look?" "Crispy made a good call. They show up nice. I'm almost done out here. 10 minutes tops." BB didn't wait for him to dismiss her, and he didn't bother trying. Conrad turned off the comms line, sat back in the chair, and pulled down his display. He cycled through the reports the crew had sent in and made a couple of check marks in his head. After the last 2 weeks, he had barely checked up anymore because while every member of the Dhampir's crew was someone that would get sent for non-judicial punishment at least once a week based on the way they acted alone, they were extremely good at their jobs. Extremely good. Right now, though, they were all bored. They had come together to decide on some flair for the ship, and Conrad knew that most corvettes and some destroyers had mascots they'd paint on the hull. Every ship in the fleet had kill markers, so next they had decided what the cover art should be. 4 designs had been shut down by Cass almost instantly, and in fact Bats had been told that if his idea went on the hull, Bats himself would be on the hull. They had settled on a stylized set of fangs set in a mouth. Their kill markers were Vral faces, drawn with cartoonish, shocked expressions with bright red X's. The tonnage of the kills was marked by simple letters: South Carolina for strike craft, C for corvette, D for destroyer, LC for light cruiser. In the 3 weeks they had been a crew, the Dhampir had a nice set of kill marks. 52 small Vral heads for fighters, 18 for corvettes, 7 for destroyers, and 3 for light cruisers. Yes, it was a good haul. There was a spot marked off to the side that had a CC for cruiser. Conrad was looking forward to putting a bug head underneath it. For now, though, he reclined back and looked out of the viewport and waited, like he had been waiting. Aside from him and BB, everyone was either in their small beds or at their station asleep. Well, he couldn't say everyone. He had a good feeling about what was happening in a few quarters. Considering the male-to-female split on this ship, he was fully convinced that the only people who weren't paired off were himself, Cass, Fidget, and the Chua, and he wasn't too sure about the Chua. The first time he had caught 2 of the crew going at it, he didn't know what to say. When talking with Cass about it, she pointed out they were having a talk about 2 crew members having sex. All the while, the 2 of them were one wardrobe malfunction and a bump away from the same thing, considering how tight the spaces were. To fully illustrate the point, she rolled her hips once while she was sliding past him. The point had been proven. Conrad decided on 2 things at that exact moment. 1, he wasn't going to complain when people who rubbed against each other any time they tried to pass each other wound up rubbing up against each other in other ways. The second was that having any conversation with Cass from here on out wasn't going to be done in the passageway because she had no shame, and frankly, he was more pent up than he wanted to admit. What living on a Corvette did to the body did not help. Every time you moved to your station, every time you moved through the ship, you were twisting, pulling yourself up, crouching, pushing down, and squeezing in and out of places. It was a constant workout just to make your way through the 3 decks. Then, of course, there was the diet. Corvettes had specially prepared meals, high protein, low carbohydrates. Everyone also had the added requirement of mandatory cardiovascular training, 30 minutes a day. You couldn't be overweight and be on a Corvette. Between the diet and the constant workout that was moving through the ship, Conrad was already achieving a level of tone on his body that he had never thought he could gain. And frankly, everyone else either was getting the same way or was already at that level. You had to be flexible, you had to be fit. You had to be able to move in tight spaces, or simply put, you were not cut out for Corvette service. Add the opposite sex in that situation, and the results were flat-out obvious to anyone with 2 neurons firing. In fact, the close nature of this ship was turning into a real problem for him, and Cass knew it. Frankly, after that conversation and the subsequent close brushes with Cass, he fully believed that Cass didn't have a soul. Some of the brushes between them were downright unnecessary, and frankly, every time he got near her now, he ran through the litany of reasons why trying to take her up on what she might be offering was a bad idea. He was her superior. She wasn't an officer. It wouldn't be right for the captain to do something like this with a crew member. It could be bad for morale, etc., etc. Cass, for her part, deemed it necessary to put him in compromising positions as frequently as possible, it seemed, after they had their little talk. It only took him a few days after that conversation to realize that the moniker that smaller Corvettes got tagged with, pleasure boats, might not be a joke about the size of the ship itself. How does one address sexual tension so thick you could cut it with a knife on a ship where the crew would be pressed against each other trying not to think about sex, while you're having a conversation explicitly about sex? This was impossible. He loved his boat. What he didn't love right now was the inactivity. Maintenance was done, all checks were done, their meal kits were fully stocked, ammo was fully stocked. The only person with anything to do right now was BB, and that was because she had volunteered. Conrad had filed all his reports. They were quite literally just floating in space, waiting for something to happen. Then it happened. The red light on his comm panel went off with a tone, and Conrad reached up, taking his personal receiver off its clip on the ceiling. "This is Dhampir Actual. Go ahead." "Dhampir Actual, this is Paris Actual." The gravelly voice of Captain Calhoun was unmistakable. The captain of the Thunderchild battleship Paris was his senior reporting officer. "How are you adjusting to command, Lieutenant?" Conrad opened his hands and looked around, then sat back in his chair and pulled his panel down in front of him. "Well, I hope. I noticed your crewman outside. A fine bit of decoration on your hull." Yes, sir," he said, hoping to God BB hadn't put Bats's ID on the hull. I let the crew decide on how they wanted to represent themselves. He felt acutely aware of the fact that he felt like he was trying to figure out if he was in trouble with his actual father when he was young. A fine display, a fine display. The older man rumbled, and Conrad felt his pulse die down. Now, for the reason I contacted you, I will be sending you operational details for Operation Naked Sun. We engage at fleet time 12:30. Conrad blinked, then looked at the onboard clock. The time read 10:42. Naked Sun acknowledged. Very good, something I didn't tell you. I started off my command days as a corvette captain myself. Captain Calhoun sounded wistful over the speakers of his headset. Tell me, is your crew everything you wanted? Yes, sir, Conrad declared. And Cass began to stir in her chair, her curly red hair cascading down as she turned and stared at him, bleary-eyed. It's a fine crew. Cass canted her head to the side, then slowly smiled at him, batting her eyes. He threw his hands out at her like he was shooing her away. He pressed the tab to mute his receiver, checked to make sure he was muted, then hissed, "Damn it, it's the Paris, cut the sexual harassment." She only laughed at him and turned back to her controls. Good, that's good. I sent you a picture of my old crew a few days ago. I'd like one of yours when you have a chance to get off and have a bit of space. You will be a fine commander one day, but relish these days. Especially with what's to come. Make every moment matter. Conrad grinned as he listened to the older man talk. On a whim, he checked to see his messages from the captain and saw the one he was talking about. He opened it and blinked. Standing in front of an older Bulldog-class corvette, one of the first of the TFS designs, was a crew of 10 people. All of them were dressed with their uniforms half done, most of them looking like they just climbed out of bed. The man in the center with his arms draped comfortably around a woman was the man he knew to be the captain. He looked relaxed, leaner than even Conrad himself was. All of them had a middle finger raised toward the camera, with a stylized misfits painted on the hull behind them. They didn't look like a professional crew, not even the captain who now commanded the Paris. They looked like a pirate gang. I'm having a look at the picture now, Conrad said, for lack of anything else to say. Captain Calhoun was the most professional officer he had ever met, but there he was, arm curled around one of his crew, resting his head on her shoulder and flipping off the camera. He glanced at the bottom and started reading off the names, and some of them were familiar. Dulhan, Vikoff, Martins, Smith, Calhoun, Hadrian, Johnson, Six, Dupree, Yee. We're a special breed corvette crew, the captain of the Paris said. I'll leave you to it. Be sure to review the operation. We'll have a commander's meeting to discuss the particulars. For now, though, take station 10 kilometers off my starboard. Conrad leaned over, jotting down the instruction. We'll have the meeting at 1200 fleet time. Paris out. Dhampir out, Conrad said in reply. Cass, jump in the chair and get us 10 kilometers off the Paris starboard flank once Bibi is inside. He watched as she slid out of the chair and curled her body into the pilot seat, wordlessly. She reached for the comms panel, heard her talking to Bibi, but shoved the conversation to the back of his mind. He brought up the operational overview, then began reading. He felt the drive kick on, feeling the light rumble in his seat as the powerful engine directed them. Cass guided the ship into place with practiced ease, but Conrad at the moment was too engrossed in what he was reading. He poured through the hyperlane maps, the instruction and fallback points. He suddenly became aware of the fact Cass was calling him. He looked back to the pilot seat only to see she wasn't there. She was standing, twisted up against her own chair, staring at him. Interesting reading? Looks like it. Are we moving out? She said. Then he motioned for her to come over to him. Curiously, she made her way through the cluttered assemblage of stations and tight-knit walls to get to him, having to lean on his shoulder as he pulled his panel around. Operation Naked Sun. Naming conventions are fun, she whispered, a little too close to his ear, and he snapped his head to find her face only an inch away from his. Yeah, he said. Then he turned back to the brief, even as she leaned on him and looked closer at the brief. A lot of the times, she made unnecessary contact with him, mostly to provoke a reaction out of him. This time, though, she was trying to see better, because the details for them were incredible. Every so often, she reached to bring up new information. What do you think, Exo? Oh, this is gonna be fun. She slowly brought up the listing of ships, then she eased back. They stayed there for a moment, with her leaning on him as they looked at the symbol for the operation, a rather uninspiring comet plunging into what passed for a star. Do you want to brief the kids, or should I? We'll do it separately. I'll take Bats, Rev, Dev, Crispy, and Fidget up here on the bridge. You get Doc, BB, Cross, Crash, and Smokey back in the maintenance bay. I'll send it to your pad just in case. He relaxed back into his chair, and she turned a bit to stand next to him, placing a hand on his headrest right behind his ear. It's about to get real interesting. You bet. Do it now? Her grin was predatory. Do it now, he replied, and she turned, heading for her station and punching the ship-wide communication. She called off the crew, told BB to get back inside, and organized the two groups as Conrad sent the operational brief to her pad. Then, a few moments later, he yanked himself out of his chair. Cass must have been distracted because when he pushed up against her to go by, she jumped and almost hit her head on the ceiling plates. He steadied her as he went by, grabbing hold of her arm and waist, keeping her from being carried along with him. For the first time since he had been on the ship and subjected to her particular methods of moving past him in confined spaces, he was the one who kept the contact for longer than needed. He was the one to maintain his hold on her that extra second. She looked back at him and blinked, wide-eyed. He hid his expression well. It wasn't often he got a reaction out of her, but he couldn't help smirking as he turned his back to her. As he got past her, he felt her eyes boring into his back before he turned. He stared at her for a second, then leaned back into the space between two consoles. Something wrong, Cass? Her grin came back, fiercer than before. Nope. She reached over and grabbed her pad, then tapped it on her thigh, never taking her eyes off him. She stood there for a few seconds more. Nope, she said again. Then she turned and began moving out of the bridge. Just before she opened the hatchway, she stopped and looked back at him, the door hanging open. He made a simple motion with his hand, ushering her onwards. There was a flash in her eyes, and for a moment he thought maybe it might not be a good idea to provoke her. Nope, she said, stepping out of the bridge and shutting the hatch behind her. Relish these days. Make every moment matter. He heard Captain Calhoun's words echoing to him from the photo he had seen. Maybe, just maybe, he would, provided this operation didn't kill him first.